So, in anticipation, the Fallen mode rework changes I'll make in a separate video, the developers have actually changed around some enemies in Tower Defense Simulator. So first of all, they've added, quote, added, a new enemy called the Fallen Dreg. This is what the Fallen Dreg looks like. It appears only in Fallen mode, has 40 health and 4 speed. Now, if this looks familiar to you, then yes, you probably have seen something very similar to it, namely the Core Block Seeker, or even stuff like the Core Blocks Undead. In fact, it's the Core Blocks Undead, which looks very, very similar to the Fallen Dreg. However, that being said, the Core Blocks Undead actually did come first. So the Core Blocks Undead was added on the 15th of March 2024, and the Fallen Dreg was obviously added quite recently. However, that being said, the Fallen Dreg did appear in the games files if you looked hard enough and you are a hacker and Below Natural banned your account. It appeared in the games file, but obviously I couldn't leak anything about it. So it's small wonder then why the developers made it in 2024, August 2024, for the Fallen mode rework, but then didn't add it, but then all of a sudden decided to add it now, and then just do nothing with it, nothing really important with it. It does, however, replace an enemy in Fallen mode. It replaces the Heavy, I believe. The Heavy doesn't appear in Fallen mode anymore. Perhaps that was the original intentions for the Core Blocks Undead. No, sorry, not the Core Blocks Undead. That's what the enemy's based on. The Fallen Dreg. The Fallen Dreg and the Core Blocks Undead, they sound very similar, so perhaps maybe that's where it comes from. As you can see, the Core Blocks Undead and the Fallen Dreg, they're basically the same enemy, and in fact, they are the same enemy appearance-wise. The only difference is that the Fallen Dreg is slightly larger than the Core Blocks Undead, and the Fallen Dreg has more health, I think, or does it? Yes, it has more health, but the Core Blocks Undead, interestingly, has 25% defense. Other than that, though, the appearance-wise, they are exactly the same, and animation-wise, they're even the same. In fact, the only difference I can see is that there's a recoloring of the legs, so the legs for the Fallen Dreg are blue, whereas here the details are slightly grey. And I think the Fallen Dreg has black skin for its arms, whereas the Core Blocks Undead has blue skin. But again, it seems very interesting that they reused the Core Blocks Undead for the Fallen mode rework, only to then scrap it, but then add it for the 2025 Fallen mode rework. However, I kind of understand why the Fallen Dreg may have been scrapped, because I can't lie, the Fallen Dreg doesn't seem in line with the Fallen enemies seen here. I do know that the Fallen enemies did appear for the Core Blocks events, well, the recent Core Blocks events for the Mega Edition, and they kind of did fit in, but only certain enemies. I don't think the Fallen Dreg is one of those enemies that really fits in with like the Fallen mode enemies. However, that being said, it is in the game now. It is an early wave enemy, and it does replace the Heavy, which I don't believe spawns in Fallen mode anymore. Which means that you only really see the Heavy in Molten, Legacy Fallen, Golden Mode, Western, Pizzeria, and high rank PvP testing. The last one of which isn't currently active in the game, and Western being Badlands 2 and Pizzeria being Pizza Party. Does it make more sense that the Fallen Dreg is in the game rather than the Heavy? I think so. However, that being said, it's a very interesting enemy to be added to the game, obviously because it's just a Core Blocks Undead remake. However, what is interesting is that they've removed a couple of other enemies. So, they've removed the Elite Boomer from Fallen mode, and given the fact that the Elite Boomer only appears in Fallen mode, it means the Elite Boomer doesn't appear anywhere else in Tower Defense Simulator. Because of this, the Elite Boomer is technically now a removed enemy, except if you have the logbook for the Elite Boomer. This therefore means that this is the first evergreen logbook that's been removed from the game. There have been other logbooks that have technically been removed, but they've been all event enemies, and there's been some impossible logbooks to get because they don't spawn in naturally. I'm thinking of the Elite Hazmat there, but interestingly, the Elite Boomer is the first enemy to have appeared in a game mode to then have been subsequently removed. This would probably be the case for some hardcore mode enemies when their hardcore mode gets reworked, because I don't think they're going to reuse all of the enemies from hardcore mode. But that being said, the Elite Boomer got there first. It is now the first exclusive logbook that was an evergreen enemy that appeared in an evergreen mode. You have to answer me for this, but I don't know if the Elite Boomer now naturally appears in the logbook anymore like it did previously. Here, I have it, the logbook, so it appears as an exclusive enemy for me. However, does it appear here if you don't have the logbook, but also does it appear in admin mode if you buy the admin mode game pass, given the fact that it's now technically an exclusive enemy? I'm willing to bet that you can't actually spawn in the Elite Boomer anymore because it doesn't appear naturally in Fallen mode, and I think there's a whitelist for enemies that you can spawn in admin mode, but we'll have to see on that. Anyone who does know, you can just drop a comment and then I'll probably read it, and then Mented will probably read it and add it to the wiki. Now, many people have speculated why the Elite Boomer has been removed from Tower Defense Simulator, or at least in Fallen mode. I think personally that it didn't really fit too much in Fallen mode. I mean, with the art style of Fallen mode, the only enemies that really, you could probably argue, that don't fit in after the Fallen Trek are the Breaker enemies. All of the enemies have these dark appearances. I mean, obviously, when the Breaker enemy appears, they look very out of place. However, when you have the Elite Boomer here, it doesn't really befit Fallen mode that well. Furthermore, Elite Boomer, I would like to say that the Elite's name tag really isn't in Fallen mode, and in fact, the Elite Boomer was the only enemy in Fallen mode previous to its removal to have the word Elite in its name. The other Elite enemies are like the Elite Abnormal and the Elite Molten. In my mind, Elite refers to multi-mode enemies, or some multi-mode enemies, and in fact there's only really 2 of 3, the Elite Hazmat as well. But then you also got stuff like the Elite Ducky and the Elite Abnormal. So this does certainly feel out of place in Fallen mode, but it's very interesting that it means in Fallen mode we don't have a Boomer enemy for the first time since it was added in Tower Defense Simulator, all the way back in 2019. Yeah, in 2019, the Boomer enemy was the Boomer enemy in Fallen mode. Then that was replaced with the Elite Boomer. Before now, we don't have an enemy like that. That being said, though, all of these enemies are annoying in their own rights. So, yeah, you could probably argue there's that much of a difficulty decrease in Fallen mode. However, that being said, the first enemy to actually harm any towers would actually be the Fallen Guardian on Wave 39. It means that the Elite Boomer, because it appeared on Wave 31 on Fallen mode, it means that you don't really need to think about the medic to unstun towers or even to cleanse your towers from its debuff if the medic actually works properly, because none of these enemies really do that anymore. I'm pretty sure I'm probably like missing something, but I don't think these enemies can stun or debuff your towers until the Fallen Guardian appears, and certainly not until the Fallen King appears on Wave 40. Because interestingly, they've removed one other enemy from Fallen mode, and that being the Templar. Yes, the Templar used to appear in Fallen mode, in the main game at least, but no longer appears. Now I could also speculate that the Templar was removed probably for the same reason that the Elite Boomer was removed, in the fact that it doesn't really befit the theme of Fallen mode all that well. The Templar is based on the original Warden, not the original Warden, that's the tower, but the Warden enemy that used to appear, well, it still does appear in Hardcore mode, but it used to appear in Polluted Wastelands 2. This is what it looks like, and you can very clearly see that the Templar is based on cues of that, but the only problem is that the Warden has unique animations, and also has an entirely different name. That being said, however, the Templar does still appear in Fallen mode. However, it is now a Hidden Wave exclusive enemy. Yeah, so the Templar exclusively appears in the Hidden Wave now, and 2 Templars do appear. So there's a Bloated Health Regen Templar and another Bloated Health Regen Templar. So there's 2 of these fuckers in the Hidden Wave, but none in the Fallen mode anymore. So it looks like the developers may have reworked the Fallen mode waves, but they forgot about reworking the Hidden Wave because the Templar's still here. However, that does mean that the Hidden Wave now technically has 1 exclusive enemy, because the Awakened Fallen King, even though it's considered its own enemy, is just the second version of the Fallen King. It's the Awakened Fallen King. It's not technically its own separate enemy. You don't get a separate logbook from it. However, the Templar does appear. So anyone saying that the Hidden Wave doesn't have any exclusive enemies or has 1 exclusive enemy, you're wrong. It has 2 now. Very cool. But that being said, you may think that the Templar has a really hard logbook to get now. It kind of does, because it doesn't actually appear in Fallen mode, but you can still get the Templar in the Polluted Wastelands 2. It does appear quite a few times there, but then it also appears in the Back to Basics challenge and the Juggernaut challenge. These aren't the hardest logbooks to get, by the way, the Templar and the Heavy, which have been removed from Fallen mode. The Heavy obviously appears in multi-mode, so you can easily get it through there, but the Templar appears quite rarely in the other game modes. That being said, there are other enemies that now exclusively appear only in challenges. So, for example, the Abnormal Boss only appears in 5 of the challenges. So even though these challenges are random and the Abnormal Boss may not appear in the challenge that's been selected, it is in the 5 out of the, I believe, 6 challenges. So you're more than likely going to get the Abnormal Boss if you do a challenge map. It's the same for the Shadow and the same for the Glitch. It's just that you need to remember to get challenge maps, or to play challenge maps, to get these enemies. Otherwise, you would have forgotten that these exist as a logbook form. It's the same for the Hazard, and it's the same for the Tank, except the Tank only appears in 4, not 5 challenges. So the Tank is slightly harder to get, plus it spawns in on Wave 30 for the challenge maps, whereas the other enemies spawn in a lot sooner and appear in much more numbers. But there are rarer enemies. So, for example, the Dark Necromancer only appears in 2 challenge maps, that being Legion and Juggernaut. And do bear in mind that the Dark Necromancer can't appear in all of the maps for Legion and Juggernaut. It has to be in a map with enemies beta not activated, because then it'll be replaced by the Necromancer seen here. And then while the Summoner boss appears in 4 challenges, do bear in mind that the Summoner boss only appears from wave 36, so after the tank, and appears in much less numbers. So I still think the Summoner boss is the hardest logbook to get to naturally. Maybe tied with the health cultist actually. I think the health cultist is actually slightly harder given the fact that you need to do 60 of them because you're not getting it in like the 1% chance, and you can't boost the chances through Scholar anymore because Scholar is a useless skill, but B, because Scholar is disabled in hardcore mode now. Which I guess is the one good thing about Scholar, is that in challenge maps it can boost the chances of you getting the Summoner boss or the tank, but barely, because the Summoner boss, I don't think the Summoner boss has that much health. Only 8,000, so that's the same as the health cultist, but it's a boost, I guess. Yeah, I mean, the Summoner boss does appear more than once a game. But as for the tank and for the other enemies, yeah, I don't think the Scholar is helping you there. I think you're still getting it through pity kills, not by random chance. However, obviously, this detracts from the main statement that the Elite Boomer has been removed from Tower Defense Simulator. It used to have a logbook, but you can no longer get it, and you can't spawn it into sandbox mode. At least it appears on the ground unless you have the logbook, which you can't get anymore. So yes, Elite Boomer, RIP. Unless you really don't... I don't think many people actually noticed that the Elite Boomer was in Tower Defense Simulator. And I can't lie, reading the obituaries for the Elite Boomer, no one seems to realise that, you know, the Elite Boomer existed before it was removed. However, maybe the Elite Boomer isn't completely dead. I can really see the Elite Boomer being used in other game modes, such as the hardcore mode rework, if that's eventually added, because I don't know what the theme of hardcore mode is going to be. Maybe it's just a mashing of load of enemies that probably don't fit hardcore mode, but we'll have to see on that. But it can't be a multi-mode enemy given the fact that the Boomer already exists, unless the developers want to be really cheeky, add the Elite Boomer like once a game or something. Or maybe the Elite Boomer should just be in the Hidden Wave, because it's already in the game, we know it exists. Why not throw it into the Hidden Wave and make it a very hard enemy to get the logbook for? That'll be very interesting.